Hi everyone, welcome to another week of Sliptember, and I'm starting this week with an overview of the fifth CHIMES, which is environment. So I've got a few principles, a few key things for you to think about, and I'll run through those. And then tomorrow we'll deep dive into a real life example of where factors around the environment have affected slip safety. So let's load up a couple of slides and we'll get into it. Okay, so there are four key areas to consider here. The first is the weather and its effects. So the analogy I use here often is Manchester versus Mauritius. So clearly it's probably going to rain more often in Manchester, but more heavily when it does rain in Mauritius. But the weather and where a building is situated will have an effect because clearly any liquid outside that's brought into a building brings with it the risk of slips. Another issue that's often overlooked around the weather is condensation, and we're going to deep dive into that tomorrow to bring a couple of examples of condensation to life for you. The second thing is the built environment. So these are all the environmental factors that pertain to the building. So this would include things like lighting, grab rails on stairs, and so on and so forth. So we need to consider that as well, consistency of surfaces, matting, and we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Third thing is steps and stairs. Now, stairs are without question the site of a lot of falls. Whether people actually slip on stairs is something that's a bit of a contentious debate, and there's quite a lot of depth to that point, but suffice it to say that steps and stairs and having a good risk assessment around those is an area that you do need to look at and you do need to strongly consider. And the key thing there is consistency of dimensions. If you want, there's an article on my website called "Do People Slip on Stairs?" and that goes into this topic in a lot of detail. Perhaps I'll link that below in the notes because I'm not going to go into this in too much detail in the video. And then the other final point is ramps and slopes. Now, we talked about a ramp last week when we were thinking about individual and how human factors relate to slip safety. But in very simple terms, if you've got a ramp or a slope, you've got a much greater requirement for friction in order to safely walk without slipping and falling. And the biggest challenge with ramps is that sometimes they're quite shallow gradients and people don't necessarily know that they're there. So think of a poolside, think of a kitchen. These will often have slight slopes in the surface to allow water to drain away. But if you can't see a slope, then you might not know that it's there. You plant your foot expecting the surface to be flat, actually it's sloped, and that can often have an effect and cause an accident. One of the key things that people get wrong when it comes to environment and when it comes to thinking about slip safety overall is that they get the difference between a dry environment and a more regularly wet or contaminated environment wrong. So what you see a lot of is entrances to buildings where people kind of incorrectly assume that because they've got some entrance matting, that must mean that this is a dry environment. In fact, that isn't the case, and I'll illustrate this point in a second. But I want to give you some data behind this, not just taking my word for it, because if you walk up and down a high street and you go past convenience stores, office buildings, whatever it might be, you'll typically find a mat a bit like this one in the picture, or perhaps even a more shallow mat than that. And people are relying on these mats to try to keep the floor surfaces from getting wet. In reality, a mat exists to dry the floor, but it requires several paces to do that. Now, the HSE and the Entrance Flooring Association did a paper on this, and they said that depending on the peak traffic per hour of people coming into and out of the building, you need a certain depth of built-in matting to perform and to keep the floor surface beyond the matting dry. And as you'll see here, if you go right down to the bottom, with high usage, we're talking about peak traffic of 800 people per hour. Now think about a supermarket, think about a busy office, think about a convenience store, think about a railway station, think about a school, think about a hospital. All of these types of buildings are likely to exceed that flow rate of 800 people per hour, bearing in mind this is people coming into and out of the building. And there, as you'll see, it says that you should have 8 to 10 meters of built-in matting. Now, over the last decade plus, I can count on one hand the number of buildings I've seen that have 8 to 10 meters of matting. And therefore, there's an assumption being made that we've got matting, the floor's going to be dry, which is actually incorrect. Because as you can see here, where we've got a busy entrance to a train station, and we've got matting of probably about 2.5 meters there maybe, on a wet day, that floor is getting saturated with water that's being dragged in from the outside because the matting simply isn't big enough to do the job of keeping the floor dry. So when it comes to entrances and thinking about matting, and this is probably the key takeaway when it comes to environment, because it's the big area that people get wrong, stand inside on a wet day and just see if the floor beyond the matting is getting wet. If it is, then you need to start thinking about that floor as being a floor that is foreseeably wet, and therefore you're going to need a floor that achieves a certain level of slip resistance, because if it's getting wet in that scenario, it's going to be impossible to keep that floor dry. What I see a lot of is people putting a cleaner or two in front of the matting and dry mopping the floor. Now, that is not going to work. Do you know why? Because the water, the liquid, doesn't just be appearing on the floor out of nowhere. It gets trafficked in on people's feet. And actually, if somebody steps through the matting and their foot is still wet, it doesn't matter if the floor is dry, because the liquid on their foot will be enough for them to slip. So you need to be not trying to dry floors that can't be kept dry. You need to be trying to make floors that can't be kept dry safe when wet. To learn about what exactly that means, I'd encourage you to watch the next couple of videos after tomorrow's, because tomorrow is going to be an example, as I said, of condensation, but the next couple of videos after that are all around the surface. So how do we quantify what a safe surface is? How do we test for that? How do we measure and monitor it over time? So I encourage you to watch that. But in the meantime, if it happens to rain over the next couple of days, just spend 5 minutes, stand inside your entrance and see if the floor is wet and there are footprints on the floor beyond the matting. If so, certainly recommend you pick up on the elements of surface. And if you've got that problem, you definitely would benefit from having a slip test. So do like and comment on this video and pick up on the other 5 ways of winning a free slip test this Sliptember. Hope you've enjoyed that, found it useful, and look forward to hearing what you see when you stand inside on a wet day and see if your reception floor does get wet or not. Cheers.